You are listening to the Amateur Church Podcast, where we pursue excellence in ministry with the right motivation for the sake of love. I'm Pastor Matt, and I'm so thankful that you are on this disciples journey with me as we begin this week reading through the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is the continuation and, to a point, a conclusion of the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, getting ready to go into the promised land. We know this is the final book of the Torah, the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, known as the law. And yet it's also a continuation of the story of this new generation of Israelites who are going into the promised land. And we'll see their story unfold in the book of Joshua and then Judges. But today, as we look at theological truths from the book of Deuteronomy, I would like to remind you that this podcast is a call for anyone who's tired of church being just a programmed organization. The Amateur Church Podcast is focused on making sure that we love Christ and love others, and that love is our greatest motivation. So thank you for joining me as we reject professional Christianity that seeks our own glory, and we rediscover a passion for Christ and His church. And what I see in the book of Deuteronomy, one of the reasons I mention that is because there's a temptation to become a professional in the sense of, let's just do the activity, let's just get it done so that we can get to a promised land. And the book of Deuteronomy is really about love for God, love from God for His people, and love for God out of response. And we will see that. So when we look at theological truths, we want to ask, what is the context of the passage? What is going on in the culture, and how does this point us to Christ? Well, the context is found in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. Listen to these words. It says, "These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazeroth and Dizahab." Now, that may not mean anything to you, but that one verse gives us the location of the Israelites right across from the promised land. They're standing at the Jordan. But listen to verse 2. This gives us even more context. "It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea." That tells us it should have only taken them 11 days to journey. Now listen to verse 3. "In the 40th year." So what we find out is that Moses is speaking to the Israelites after 40 years of wandering, an 11-day journey. And what we're going to see from this book is a closing sermon by Moses to these children of Israel. Now realize the book of Deuteronomy can be seen in 2 main ways. Number one, it is a legal document. We're going to see the covenant spelled out in the book of Deuteronomy, and I'll explain that in just a moment. But it's also a sermon. And so the sermon, you're going to hear that quite a lot this week. The sermon that Moses gives them, this great book, this final part of the Torah, 34 chapters. 33 chapters of the sermon, that last chapter, the death of Moses, 33 chapters of a sermon that Moses preaches to them, reminding them that God loved them and He desires them to obey out of love for Him. And so we're going to see it is His last sermon to the children, and getting them ready to walk into this promised land. So why do we have the book of Deuteronomy? Well, first, we see the reestablishment of commandments. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 6 through 21, you're actually going to see the re-giving of the law. In fact, Deuteronomy means the second law. Now, don't think God is giving them another law. He's giving them the law a second time. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 5 is the 10 Commandments repeated. Why does He have to give this again? Because He's restating the law to a brand new generation. Remember, the book of Numbers walked us through 38 years after those first 2 years of wandering, in order for that nation to die out. 40 years, and I was reminded by one of our church members, 40 years for every day that the spies were in the land, spying out the land of the promised land, and they rejected going in, rejected God's command. So 40 years they were in there, and it allowed time for this previous generation to die out. God is also preparing the people for the promised land. Look at chapter 5, verse 1. It says, Then Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances which I am speaking today in your hearing, that you may learn them and observe them carefully. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, with all those of us alive here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face at the mountain from the midst of the fire, while I was standing before the Lord and you at the time, to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. So he is preparing them for the promised land. He's saying, I've given you this promise that you will need to live by according to this land. And Moses says, I stood there in between you and God and gave this law to you. So he's restating the law, he's preparing the people, but he's also transferring the covenant. And this is one of the ways that I want you to see the book of Deuteronomy. A lot of times we read it and we say, well, it's just a law book, do's and don'ts, and that's all it is. But really, step back for a moment, and this is how the culture plays into this book. We see the context, but I want you to see the culture. And the culture was focused on the word covenant. Now, the covenant is a binding agreement between two, sometimes more parties, but two parties. Usually you had a high authority, one that had a lot of prestige or power, and a lower authority. And this is what we see in this passage. We see God as the greater authority, and then Israel as the servant, the lower group. And God is saying, I will bless you. I will show you peace and tranquility if you'll obey me. And this was a common thing between nations, warring nations. A greater nation may take up a smaller nation and give protection or peace to them, and say, as long as you abide by our commands. So what we're going to see is actually the book of Deuteronomy is a covenant book. And not just that it has themes of covenant, it's actually a legal document. I want you to walk through this with me. Again, the covenant had 5 parts to it, and I want you to consider this. The first part was called the preamble, in which it introduces the author. We see this in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, in which it says, Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had commanded him to give them. And so think of, when you hear preamble, you may even think about America and our founding documents. Our preamble begins, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And so that introductory paragraph introduces the author. Well, then from that point, you get the second portion of the covenant, and that's the history or the story. And that emphasizes glory and authority. He's going to, from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 3, verse 29, Moses is going to lay out, this is what took place. This is how we did this. This is the conquest we had. This is how the spies messed up and we wandered in the wilderness. And so for 3 chapters, he gives the history and the story. Again, take American history, take this preamble, and it shares the history, very briefly, of how the founding fathers came to the point at which they were separating from England. It emphasizes glory of God and the authority God has over them in this history. So that's part 2. Okay, so just think down. You can write these down: preamble, then history or the story. Then third, you have the requirements. What is required in the midst of the contract? And this is the bulk of the book of Deuteronomy, beginning with chapter 4. In chapter 4, it says, Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching to you to perform, so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. And then he reminds them, You shall not take away any word which I've commanded to you. And so from that point all the way to chapter 26. So we've got tons of chapters in this. In fact, go to chapter 26, verse 16, and here's how he closes out this section. He says, "This day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and ordinances. You shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. You have today," so again, Moses is speaking one long sermon to these people. "You have today declared the Lord to be your God, and that you would walk in his ways and keep his statutes, his commandments, and his ordinances, and listen to his voice. The Lord has today declared to you to be his people, a treasured possession, as he promised you, and that you should keep all his commandments, and that he will set you high above all nations which he has made for praise, fame, and honor, and that you shall be a consecrated people to the Lord your God, and he has spoken." So the end of chapter 26, we get the end of the requirements. And really, when you walk through the chapters, you will actually see, we'll see this later this week, you'll actually see a comparison of different chapters within this group, chapters 4 through 26, that correspond to the 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments are laid out in chapter 5, and then we're going to see that from chapter 6 through 26, each of the 10 Commandments are actually spelled out in greater detail, how they show divine authority and dignity and commitment and honor and human authority and dignity and kindness and human rights. We'll talk about that and especially deal with some ethical issues. Then in chapter 27, so here's how the document goes: preamble, history, requirements, and then you've got a couple of verses in chapter 27 that show reminders, or when the covenant is to be read, when they should read the book of Deuteronomy, much like we have in our Constitution, when it should be read, that we should be reminded of it. Look at chapter 27. Verse 1 says, "Then Moses and the elders of Israel charged the people, saying, Keep all the commandments which I command you today. So it shall be on the day when you cross the Jordan to the land which the Lord your God gives you, that you shall set up for yourselves large stones and coat them with lime, and write on them all the words of this law when you cross over, so that you may enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you." So in chapter 27, we see these are reminders when the covenant is to be read. And then chapter 28 through the end of the book up to chapter 23 gives the results, curses and blessings, really through chapter 31, curses and blessings. He is going to share with them, here's what will take place if you follow God. Here's what will take place if you do not follow God. There are curses if you disobey. There are blessings if you obey. And so put this together. That's walking through the book of Deuteronomy. We get the preamble in chapter 1, which says, hey, this is who's writing this. We get the story, the history and the story of Israel, of why they're where they're at, and that's the first chapter 1 through chapter 3. We get the requirements, what's expected. That's chapter 4 through 26. We get the reminders of when it should be read, chapter 27, 1 through 3, and then we get the results, the curses and the blessings, 28 really through 28, 29, 30, and the promises that would come up. And then Moses is going to remind them again in chapter 31, give some last counsel of how they should not forsake the covenant, but be obedient to God. We see Joshua commissioned. We see Moses' song at the end and his blessing toward them, and then the death of Moses in chapter 34. In all of this, you say, okay, we just did an overview of Deuteronomy, but why? Because you must understand the literature of Deuteronomy to get the theology of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy as a legal code book, as a covenant, is all about the love that God has for Israel and how he expects them to respond. You say, well, Matt, hold on just a second. I see a lot of lists of rules, but I don't really see love. Follow along with me and just hear this out. Deuteronomy 4, verse 37. Notice what God says. Notice what Moses says. To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord, He is God, that there is no other besides Him. Out of the heavens He let you hear His voice to discipline you, and on earth He let you see His great fire, and you heard His words from the midst of the fire. Because He loved your fathers, therefore He chose their descendants after them, and He personally brought you from Egypt by His great power. Chapter 7, verse 7. Listen to these words. The Lord did not set His love on you nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the other peoples, for you were the fewest of the peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which He swore to you, to your forefathers. The Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh the king of Egypt. Look at chapter 10, verse 15. He says, Yet on your fathers did the Lord set His affection to love them, and He chose their descendants after them, even you above the peoples, as it is this day. And in chapter 23, verse 5, check this out. He says, Nevertheless, the Lord your God was not willing to listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loves you. Many people think of the book of Deuteronomy and they see a list of do's and don'ts and say, well, God's just a meanie. No, God is love and He loves us. And this is the responsibility then of the people. They are saved by grace, not works. If God's love for them is set on them, then notice His grace comes to them before they do anything. Look at chapter 4 again, verse 1. Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform, so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. He gave the statutes after He showed His love and said, I want you to go in and take possession. God does not expect us to obey in order to be loved. He loves us. And this is a pattern we see in the New Testament. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 29. He says, Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it may be well with them and with their sons forever. Go and say to them, return to your tents. But as for you, stand here by me, that I may speak to you all the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which you shall teach them, that they may observe them in the land which I give them to possess. He says in verse 33, You shall walk in all the way which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you shall possess. They have a responsibility to obey so that they could experience blessing, not cursing. Chapter 6, verse 4 really spells it out even better. This Shema, what they should hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. And He says the reason. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which He swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities which you did not build. Go all the way down. It says, verse 13, You shall fear only the Lord your God. You shall worship Him and swear by His name. You shall not follow other gods. Verse 15, For the Lord your God in the midst of you is a jealous God. Otherwise, the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you. God says, it is out of love. I have you as my special possession. And consider this. God chose them out of all the nations on the earth. And they, in this, would learn to fear and love Him. Chapter 10, verse 12. Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in His ways and love Him, and serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments, keep the Lord's commandments and His statutes, which I am commanding you today for good. He says, For the Lord your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who does not show partiality nor take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and shows His love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve Him and cling to Him. He is your praise and He is your God. All of these verses, I want to remind you, Deuteronomy is not just a list, but like Leviticus, it is a love letter. It is a retelling of the law because God loved them enough to get them out of Egypt and get the Egypt out of them. So what do we learn from these? Well, number one, there was a delay based on disobedience. The Israelites disobeyed God. They were delayed in their ability to go into the promised land. Even a generation didn't get to go. Moses would not be able to go. Delay is sometimes based on disobedience, but delay can also be a time where we grow and mature. And also, mercy is greater than our mistakes. Instead of God getting rid of the entire nation, starting over, instead of God taking his wrath on them and making a new people, God shows mercy. And the book of Deuteronomy is a book of mercy. Yes, it's a covenant book because it's a covenant of love, not law. And so I want to remind you today, as you read the book of Deuteronomy this week, see the love of God poured out and see how it points us to the greater prophet, the greater love, Jesus Christ. Because everything I just read to you from these passages is a picture of what Christ does for his people. He loves us. He bought us back. He redeemed us even before we could do anything for him. For God demonstrated his love for us in this. Romans 5:8 says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So today, my prayer is that you would see Deuteronomy as a gospel-centered book of God's covenant, new covenant in Christ with us based on this old covenant. As a prayer point for us to think about as we close out this episode, you can pray this week. Part of our prayer is times of thanksgiving, and I would just encourage you this week, take time to thank God for those long periods of teaching, maybe 40 days, maybe 40 years, where God allowed the delays of your life based on your disobedience or based on circumstances to actually provide mercy and grace where it would be a turnaround in your life. Because long periods of teaching can actually be turnarounds to get us on the right track. And this was what it took for the Israelites in the wilderness for 40 years to get them prepared for the promised land. And sometimes it takes a wilderness event for us. But ultimately, those delays, though based on disobedience sometimes, can produce a greater devotion to God. And his mercy is always greater than our mistakes. I love you. I'm praying for you. Stakes in the ground.